History remembers Typhon as the monster that nearly destroyed the gods. But what if the real story is not about a monster at all? What if it is about the cost of a world that chose order over chaos? Let that thought settle. Feel the weight of your own body against the surface beneath you, the quiet surrender of muscle and bone. If it feels right, let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Allow yourself to drift back, past the ruins of empires, past the myths you think you know, to a time when the earth itself was still raw, and the gods were new. To the Corycian Cave in the mountains of Cilicia, where the air carries the cold breath of a deeper darkness, a place where the boundary between the world and the abyss is thin. What you will find here is not just a battle. It is the birth of chaos from a mother's grief, the flight of the gods into animal skins, and the moment a king of heaven knelt before a terror that nearly unmade everything. And if, by the end, you wish to carry this quiet with you, you know where to find us. So let the path carry you back. Back before the mountain, back before the gods had even decided what this story would be. Chapter 1. The Weight of Unspent Fury. In a cave deep in Cilicia, the darkness had begun to glow. The war was over. The Titans had fallen, chained in the pit of Tartarus, and the world above was learning to breathe again. On Olympus, the halls were quiet. Zeus sat upon his throne, the thunderbolt resting across his knees, still warm from the years of fighting. Light pooled on the marble floor like spilled honey. It was a peace that had cost everything to win, and the gods held it like a held breath too tight, too careful, as if it might break at any moment. Below the mountain, in the mortal valleys, the earth was healing. The scars of the war, the cracked plains, the burning forests were already softening under new grass and wildflowers. Shepherds returned to the hillsides with their flocks, and the sound of the sea against the shore was a steady, reassuring rhythm. The world did not know it was waiting. The world thought the worst was already over. The world was wrong. There is no need to picture the peace too clearly. It is enough to know it was there, fragile and complete, and that nothing beneath it slept. Deep in the places where the roots of mountains tangled with the bedrock of the world, something had been listening. The earth herself, Gaia, had watched her first children, the Titans, be torn from her and thrown into darkness. She had borne it in silence, pressing her grief into the soil. But grief, left alone too long, does not fade. It changes. She rose from a cleft in a nameless mountain, her body heavy with the weight of centuries. Her hair was tangled with ivy and old moss, her feet leaving impressions of wet soil on the stone. She did not walk so much as the ground carried her forward, a slow, inevitable drift. Her eyes, deep forest green, were fixed on something far below the surface. She was no longer mourning. She was deciding. The gods on Olympus did not feel her movement. They were drunk on victory, and the wine of peace made them forget that the earth beneath their thrones was a living thing with a will of its own. Only Hestia, tending the hearth at the center of the great hall, paused for a moment and looked into the flames. She saw nothing, but the fire flickered, just once, as if a cold wind had passed through a room with no windows. Gaia descended, not into the earth, she was the earth, but into a deeper register of herself, into the places where the world's bones pressed against the abyss. Tartarus waited there, older than the gods, older than the Titans, a darkness so profound it had no name. It was not a place of punishment alone. It was a presence, and it had been alone for a very long time. She reached toward it without words, and it answered with a tremor that ran through the entire planet. The union of Earth and the abyss was not an act of passion. It was an act of desperate, ancient purpose, a last weapon forged from the oldest materials the universe possessed. In the depths beneath the land that would one day be called Cilicia, a new heap began to build. The rock softened. Veins of molten gold and obsidian threaded through the darkness like the first tentative lines of a drawing that no one had yet learned how to read. The first sound came weeks later. It was not loud. It was not even recognizable as a sound at first. More a shift in the pressure of the air. A subsonic hum that made the shepherds on the Anatolian highlands feel suddenly tired, suddenly heavy, as if the sky had grown thicker. Their goats stopped grazing and lifted their heads. The birds fell silent. Then, very far away, a single low note rolled across the mountains, and the ground shivered. The gods heard it. On Olympus, the golden cups trembled on the tables. Zeus opened his eyes. He did not stand. He did not speak. He simply listened. The way a man listens to a sound in the dark that he has never heard before but somehow already fears. The note did not repeat. The silence that followed was worse because it was not silence. It was a held breath, waiting to be released. Beneath the earth, in a cavern so vast that the light of 1,000 torches would have been swallowed within a few feet, something was taking shape. It had no name yet. It had no form that could be understood. But the darkness was no longer empty. It was full of heat, full of weight, full of the slow, deliberate labor of a creature being assembled from the bones of chaos itself. The world above carried on, unaware that its sentence had already been written. The gestation was not measured in days or months, but in the slow grinding of tectonic plates, the restless roll of magma beneath the crust. The earth grew feverish. In the valleys of Cilicia, the hot springs began to boil where they had only ever simmered. Strange vapors rose from cracks in the limestone, carrying a smell that no one recognized. Not the clean sulfur of a normal vent, but something organic, something that tasted of burning hair and old blood. The animals felt it first and most clearly. Wolves came down from the high forests, moving through villages with a quiet, deliberate unease. Their eyes too intelligent, their bodies too thin. They did not hunt. They simply passed through, heading away from the mountains. And the people who saw them understood without speaking that something in the high country had turned wrong. The birds followed. Whole flocks rose from the cliffs and did not return. In the Corycian Cave, where the nymphs had sung for centuries and pilgrims had left offerings of honey and wool, the air changed. The constant, cool breath that had always flowed from the entrance grew warm, then hot, then scorching. The stalactites wept faster. The deep galleries, where no human had ever walked, began to glow with a faint, angry orange light that pulsed like the inside of a living heart. The cave had stopped being a sanctuary. It had become a womb. Gaia did not return to the surface. She remained in the depths, wrapped around the thing she was making, her grief now indistinguishable from her purpose. She had not created a child. She had created an argument, a final, unanswerable rebuttal to the reign of the gods who had taken everything from her. And in the darkness, the argument opened its first eye. It was golden, featureless, and utterly without innocence. The second sound was not a note. It was a chorus. From beneath the earth, 100 voices rose at once. The roar of a lion, the bellow of a bull, the shriek of a hunting hawk, the hiss of a serpent, and sounds that had no earthly source. Sounds that were not meant to exist. They did not harmonize. They collided, a wall of noise that shattered the air over the Anatolian mountains and sent avalanches crashing down into valleys that had been quiet for 1,000 years. On Olympus, the gods stood. Not in panic, not yet, but they stood and they looked at one another with the expression of people who had just realized that a locked door had quietly swung open. Zeus rose from his throne and walked to the edge of the great hall, where the marble floor ended and the open sky began. He looked east, toward the mountains of Cilicia, and for the first time since the Titans fell, he felt something cold settle into the pit of his stomach. The mortals had no framework for what they were experiencing. The ground swayed beneath their feet. The sky bruised purple and green at the edges, as if the horizon itself was becoming infected. Fishermen on the Cilician coast saw the sea retreat from the shore, a long, slow, sucking withdrawal, and they knew, in their bones, that it would return with a force they could not outrun. The world was holding its breath, and it was the worst thing any living creature had ever felt. Deep beneath the mountain, the thing that would soon be called Typhon, though no name had yet been spoken, no word existed that could hold it, was almost complete. Its vast torso, black and cracked, like cooling lava, filled the cavern from floor to vaulted ceiling. Its 100 heads, still blind, still silent, rested in a crown of sleeping serpents around its shoulders. It had not yet drawn breath, but the air around it was already on fire. Gaia uncoiled herself from her creation and withdrew. She had done what she came to do. She did not speak a blessing. She did not speak a curse. She simply receded into the rock, her presence fading like groundwater after a flood, leaving behind only the immense, pregnant silence of a weapon waiting to be triggered. The creature slept, and the world above it continued to unravel without knowing why. The peace that the gods had won was not broken yet, but it was no longer a peace. It was a curtain, thin as a shroud, stretched across a stage where the final act was already assembling itself in the dark. The war that was coming would not resemble the one that had come before. It would be fought not for territory or power, but for the right of the cosmos to remain ordered at all. And its first breath was only moments away. Chapter 2. The Shape of Primordial Sorrow. He rose from the mountain, not as a monster, but as an ending. The cavern beneath Cilicia had become a cathedral of silence. The labor was finished. In the absolute darkness, where the air was thick enough to feel, something immense and perfectly still occupied the center of the void. No breath stirred. No muscle twitched. It was as if the mountain itself had grown a heart, and the heart was waiting a pause, not of rest, but of gathering. The creature that would be called Typhon was complete, and it had not yet opened its eyes. The form was too vast to comprehend in a single glance, even if there had been light enough to see it. A torso of black volcanic stone rose from the cavern floor, cracked with fissures that glowed a deep, smoldering orange, as if a dying sun had been buried inside the flesh. From the waist down, the body dissolved into a nest of colossal serpentine tails, their obsidian scales edged in crimson, coiled around one another in slow, sleeping spirals that filled every ravine and hollow of the subterranean chamber. From each shoulder sprouted 50 dragon heads, their long necks drooping like sleeping serpents, 100 heads in all. Their scales were matte charcoal, their citrine eyes closed, their jaws slack and peaceful. They rested in a tangled crown around the central head, a vast, humanoid face of terrible, ancient majesty, framed by a mane of living serpents and a sweep of jagged obsidian horns. The face was still, expressionless, the molten gold eyes sealed shut, the features heavy with an unspoken sorrow. The arms, each as thick as a river gorge, lay motionless at the creature's sides. Where hands should have been, another 50 dragon heads clustered on each wrist, their mouths closed, their breathing shallow and synchronized. The fingers of the world's last monster were made of jaws. The whole form was a weapon, but in that suspended moment before consciousness, it was also a sculpture, terrible and beautiful, like a cathedral built to honor the end of everything. Then the air moved. It was not a wind. There was no wind in that sealed chamber, but a shift in pressure, A slow, deep inhalation that pulled at the cavern walls. The creature's vast chest, black and fissured, rose for the first time. The 100 dragon heads stirred, their nostrils flaring. The molten fissures in the torso brightened from orange to gold. And then, with a sound like the tearing of a continent, Typhon drew his first breath, and the air in the cavern caught fire. The exhalation was not breath. It was sound. 100 voices erupting at once, each a different register of chaos. The roar of a lion, the bellow of a bull, the shriek of a hawk, the hiss of a serpent, the howl of a wolf, and beneath them all, the deep, resonant boom of the central throat, a sound that had no animal equivalent, a note that belonged only to the abyss. The cavern walls cracked. Stalactites fell like spears. The mountain above convulsed. The 100 dragon eyes opened, citrine and slit-pupilled. They blinked in the firelight, not with confusion, not with rage, but with a kind of vast, slow recognition, as if each head was remembering a separate terror it had been made to deliver. The central eyes opened last. They were not citrine. They were pools of molten gold, featureless and blazing, and they held no malice. They held something worse, an ancient, patient sorrow, the knowledge of a creature born with a single purpose and no choice in the matter. The serpentine tails uncoiled, the sound of its scale against scale, obsidian grinding over basalt, was like a mountain range shifting in its sleep. The arms lifted, the 100 hand heads waking, testing their jaws. Typhon rose, not with violence, but with a slow, inevitable majesty, his horned crown scraping the vault of the cavern, his tails filling every passage, his presence so absolute that the rock itself seemed to shrink away from him. Gaia, withdrawn into the deep stone, felt her creation move. She did not weep. She did not smile. She simply receded further, her purpose fulfilled, her grief now given a shape that could walk and roar and tear the sky apart. The mother of monsters had given birth to the father of all of them, and she knew with the cold clarity of the ancient that she would never touch him again. The creature was no longer hers. It belonged to the world now. The mountain above the cavern began to fracture. Great fissures split the limestone, and jets of superheated steam screamed into the Anatolian sky. The shepherds who had returned to the high pastures fled again, their flocks scattered. The earth was no longer trembling. It was breaking. And from the deepest of the cracks, a sound emerged that had never been heard before. Not a single roar, but a chorus, 100 voices woven into one. The first and only announcement Typhon would ever make. The world's last monster was awake. The emergence was not a single event, but a slow, geological unfolding. The limestone of the Cilician highlands splintered like eggshell, and through the widening fissures, coils of obsidian serpent tail, thicker than ancient cedar trunks, pushed into the daylight. The sky, which had been a clear and cloudless blue moments before, curdled into a bruised confusion of purple and charcoal. The sun seemed to hesitate, its light dimming as if recoiling from something it was never meant to illuminate. The first of the dragon heads rose into the open air. 100 serpentine necks lifted through the smoke and dust, their charcoal scales shedding powdered rock, their citrine eyes blinking against a brightness they had not been designed to tolerate. They tasted the wind, the salt from the distant sea, the dry scent of wild thyme crushed under collapsing boulders, and for a fleeting instant, their expressions were not those of monsters. They were the faces of newborn things, bewildered by the weight of their own existence. Then the central head emerged. It rose above the crest of the shattered mountain, vast and humanoid, the face of a primordial king carved from cooling lava and crowned with jagged obsidian horns. The molten gold eyes swept across the landscape, the receding coastline, the white-capped peaks, the tiny, fleeing shapes of animals and men, and in them there kindled something that was not rage, but recognition. Typhon saw the world, and the world, for the first time, saw Typhon. Neither would ever be the same. His form, now fully revealed against the smoking ruin of the mountain, was a geography unto itself. From the waist up, the torso of a giant, cracked and seamed with inner fire, arms outstretched to the horizons. From the waist down, a tangle of serpentine coils that still unspooled from the cavern below, each one capable of leveling a forest with a single convulsion. The 100 handheads snapped at the air, testing it, learning it. The 100 shoulder heads swayed in a slow, hypnotic dance, and from each throat issued a different voice, a living orchestra of every sound that had ever inspired fear. He did not move to destroy, not yet. He stood in the ruin of his own birth, the rubble of a mountain scattered around him, and he was still. The molten fissures in his chest pulsed with a rhythm that was almost peaceful, the slow, heavy beat of a heart that had been forged in the abyss. The sorrow in the central face deepened. It was the expression of a creature who understood, on some level below thought, that he had been made to be an ending, and that every living thing now looking upon him could see nothing else. The smaller creatures of the mountain had no such complexity of feeling. A golden eagle that had nested on the high cliffs for a decade launched itself from its eyrie and flew south without looking back. A green lizard, caught on a boulder, now tilting into the new abyss, scrambled desperately toward a crevice. A swallowtail butterfly, its brief life already half over, was carried upward on a thermal of superheated air, its wings catching the volcanic glow before it vanished. The world's oldest inhabitants were already leaving. They understood what the gods had not yet fully grasped. Gaia, buried in the deep stone, felt the sunlight touch her son's face. It was the last sensation she permitted herself before she closed her ancient awareness and withdrew into the long, dark sleep of the fulfilled. She had created a living argument against the order of Olympus, an argument of scale and voice and fire. Whether it would win or lose was no longer hers to decide. The Earth Mother had spoken her final word, and that word was now standing astride the ruined mountain, roaring into a sky that had never been so small. On Olympus, the gods had fallen silent. The 100 voices reached them as a distant, terrible drone, a vibration that made the wine shiver in the cups and the golden fibulae tremble against their chests. Zeus, still standing at the edge of the hall, had not moved since the first tremor. His lapis blue eyes were fixed on the eastern horizon, where a column of black smoke and orange fire now rose like a second, angrier sun. He knew, with the certainty of a king who had already fought one war for the cosmos, that this was not an invasion. It was a reckoning. Typhon took his first step. It was not a stride so much as a continental shift. The ground for 100 miles convulsed. The sea retreated from the shore, and a crack opened in the earth that ran all the way to the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. The 100 heads roared in unison, and the sound was no longer a chorus of animals. It was a single coherent statement, a wordless declaration that the age of the Olympians was conditional, and the condition was now being tested. The monster began to move westward, and the world braced itself for what would follow. He was not born a monster. He was made one, assembled from the oldest darkness, by a mother who had run out of tears and turned to stone and fire instead. And as his colossal form began its slow, world-shaking migration toward the heart of the divine order, there was no malice in his molten gaze. There was only the unbearable weight of a purpose he had not chosen. The tragedy of Typhon was not that he was terrible. It was that he was innocent, and the universe had no room for an innocence that large. Chapter 3. When Gods Become Beasts. The sky bled, the sea fled, and a white cow stood trembling in the reeds. Typhon moved. Each step was not a footfall, but a rearrangement of the earth's bones. The ground ahead of him cracked open in long, jagged wounds, and behind him the land lay flattened. Forests pressed into the soil like dried flowers in a book. His 100 voices never stopped. They rolled across the hills in waves of dissonance. The bellow of a bull layered over the shriek of a hawk, the hiss of serpents threading beneath the roar of lions. No living thing had ever heard such a sound, and no living thing could escape it. The landscape began to die of noise. Mountain slopes that had stood for eons shuddered and shed their limestone skins. Rivers jumped their banks and boiled where the heat of his passing seeped into the water table. The sea along the Cilician coast drew back in a long, slow, sucking retreat, exposing cliffs of black basalt no human eye had ever seen. The air thickened with the taste of ash and sulfur, coating the tongue, clinging to the throat. It was not a battle yet. It was an atmosphere. The animals fled in droves. Wolves running alongside deer. Eagles abandoning their nests. Wild goats pouring down from the high crags and rivers of gray fur. A green lizard, its bronze-flecked scales vivid against the gray rock, clung to a trembling boulder until the vibration threw it into the dust. A swallow-tailed butterfly, caught in a thermal of superheated air, spiraled upward, its black and white wings fluttering against a sky that was no longer blue, but a deep, glowering violet. The world was emptying itself before the coming of the giant. On Olympus, the great hall had become a place of whispers. Gods who had faced the Titans without flinching now watched the eastern horizon with eyes too wide, too fixed. The golden cups had long since stopped trembling. They had fallen and shattered. Dionysus clutched his thysis with white knuckles. Artemis, usually so still, paced the marble floor. Only Athena stood motionless beside her father, her gray eyes like winter stone, her hand resting on the shaft of her spear. She did not speak. There was nothing yet to say. The flight began not with a decision, but with a breaking. Hera was the first to transform. The queen of the gods, her regal Stephon still glinting on her brow, suddenly bent forward, her white linen chiton melting into hide, her limbs shortening, a tail switching where no tail had been. In the space of a breath, a white cow stood in her place, lowing with the terror of a goddess who had just understood what fear felt like. The others followed. Apollo became a hawk, launching from the colonnade. Hermes, an ibis. Artemis crouched and shrank into the sleek, shadowed form of a cat, her silver bow clattering to the marble. Ares, the god of war, hurled himself into the sea and became a fish, a glittering, desperate flash of bronze scales, disappearing into the deep. Dionysus tumbled into a goat, his thyrsus rolling away. One by one, the immortals shed their divinity and scattered southward, a terrified menagerie, streaming across the sky and sea toward the mudflats of Egypt. No one looked back. The Nile Delta received them as it had received so many refugees, without judgment, without welcome. The hawk perched on a broken papyrus stem. The white cow stood belly deep in the brown water, her flanks heaving. The ibis waded through the shallows, its long beak probing the mud, as if it had forgotten it had ever been a god. The cat crouched in the reeds, golden eyes unblinking. They hid among the lotus and the silt, and the silence of their shame was louder than any of the voices they had fled. The Corycian Cave was empty now. The nymphs who had sung in its galleries for centuries were gone, their altars overturned, their offerings scattered and trampled. The air that had once been cool and sacred now pulsed with a dry, scorching heat, and the deep galleries still glowed with the afterbirth light of the monster's emergence. A single pipistrelle bat, disturbed from its sleep, fluttered in confused circles near the ceiling, its echo calls bouncing back from walls that no longer answered with the old, familiar shapes. The sanctuary had become a scar. You do not need to imagine the sound that drove the gods from their thrones. Your body already knows it, the way a sudden, deep noise can press against the chest, make the heart stutter, make the bones feel hollow. That is what filled the world from horizon to horizon. A pressure more than a sound. A constant thrumming weight that left no room for thought. And in the brief gaps between the roars, there was something worse. The suggestion that the noise was not random, but deliberate, as if the monster was speaking a language the universe had forgotten. Only two remained. Zeus and Athena stood on the lip of Olympus, the wind from the east pulling at their garments, hot and foul. Zeus had donned his muscled bronze cuirass, the crimson warrior's cloak pinned at his shoulder, the thunderbolt a steady, humming presence in his grip. His lapis blue eyes, fixed on the approaching column of fire and smoke, held no fear now. They held a terrible stillness, the look of a king who had built this order with his own hands and knew that he might have to bury it to save it. Beside him, Athena waited, her gray eyes like flint. The storm was coming. The sea did not simply retreat, it fled. Along the coasts of Cyprus and the Levant, the waters pulled back to reveal vast shelves of glistening black basalt, ancient shipwrecks laid bare to the sun, the ribs of old vessels bleaching in the sudden light. Fishermen who had spent their lives on those shores ran inland, abandoning their boats, their nets, their fathers' shrines. They did not know what they were running from, only that the world had turned against them, and the sea was no longer something they could trust. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a wound. The smoke from Typhon's passing, dense, black, threaded with veins of glowing orange, had wrapped the heavens in a shroud, and through the gaps in that shroud, strange lights flickered, lightning without clouds, thunder without rain. The 100 voices had merged into a single, undifferentiated roar, a wall of sound that made the air itself feel solid. Birds fell from the sky, their tiny hearts stopped by the pressure. In the fields, cattle lay down and would not rise. The Corycian Cave, miles behind him now, continued to bleed light from its entrance. The warm, pulsing glow that had once signaled a birth now signaled an absence, a wound that would never fully heal. The offerings left by pilgrims for centuries, small terracotta figures, bronze coins, twists of wool lay crushed under the rubble of the collapsing entrance. The nymphs who had tended the sanctuary were gone, scattered into the hills, their songs replaced by the ceaseless, grinding tremor of a world coming apart at the seams. In Egypt, the gods hid. The white cow stood motionless in the shallows, her dark eyes reflecting the strange, bruised sky. The hawk perched on a broken column of an old temple, its head cocked, listening to the distant roar. The ibis probed the mud with mechanical repetition. The cat watched the horizon from the shelter of a fallen obelisk, its tail twitching. They did not speak to one another. They could not. Their voices were locked inside the forms of beasts. And even if they could have spoken, what words would have sufficed to capture the shame of gods in hiding? Athena turned her head, just slightly, and looked back into the empty hall of Olympus. The hearth at its center, Hestia's eternal flame, still burned, but it was the only light left in a palace that had once blazed with divine presence. The benches where the gods had feasted were overturned. A single laurel wreath, dropped by Apollo in the moment of his transformation, lay on the marble, its green leaves already browning. The silence inside the hall was absolute, and it was more terrible than the roar outside, because it was the sound of an order that had already fallen. Zeus raised the thunderbolt. He did not hurl it. He simply lifted it, holding it across his body like a barrier, in the light of it blazing celestial gold, edged with arcs of electric blue, pushed back the gloom for 100 yards in every direction. His bronze cuirass reflected the fire of his own weapon, and his lapis blue eyes, for the first time since the flight began, were no longer still. They burned. He was not a king defending a throne. He was a craftsman defending the thing he had made, the order, the boundaries, the fragile peace that Typhon was now unmaking with every step. Athena drew her spear. It was a simple gesture, economical and precise, and it spoke more than any battle cry. She had been born of her father's mind, fully armed, a goddess of strategy and wisdom, and she understood better than any of the Olympians what this moment required. It required standing still when every instinct demanded flight. It required looking at a chaos so absolute that the gods themselves had broken, and not breaking. Her gray eyes met her father's, and something passed between them that needed no words. Typhon, still far to the east but closing, paused. It was not hesitation. It was the momentary stillness of a storm gathering its strength. His 100 heads turned, their citrine eyes scanning the horizon, and the central humanoid face tilted slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. The molten gold eyes narrowed. In the deep fissures of his chest, the volcanic light pulsed faster. He had sensed them, the two presences that had not run, the 2 points of resistance that now stood between him and the total unmaking of the cosmos. The world fell into a strange, suspended quiet. Not silence. The 100 voices still murmured and growled, and the earth still trembled, but a pause, a held breath. The smoke hung motionless. The sea stopped retreating. The animals that still lived crouched where they were and waited. It was the quiet that exists at the center of a hurricane, the still point around which everything else spins. And in that quiet, the 2 defenders of Olympus waited. They did not pray. They did not hope. They simply stood, and the storm knew their names. The reign of terror lasted only a handful of days, a brief, apocalyptic flicker between the Titanomachy and the final battle. But in the memory of the world, it would last forever. Typhon did not need to win. He only needed to exist, to walk, to roar, and the entire architecture of divine rule had nearly collapsed. The gods had fled. The earth had broken. The sky had bled. And all of it had happened not because of a war, but because of a single creature's unhurried approach. The final battle was about to begin. But the real damage, the wound to the idea that order was permanent, was already complete. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Thunderbolt. He climbed the mountain alone, carrying the weight of a broken world. The hall of Olympus was empty now. The golden cups lay where they had fallen. The benches stood at odd angles, pushed back by gods who had risen and never returned. Only the hearth at the center still lived, its flame pale and steady, tended by a goddess who had not fled because she had never been capable of flight. Hestia knelt beside the fire, her white linen chiton pooled around her, her gray eyes fixed on the embers. She did not look up as Zeus passed. She simply fed the flame another branch of olive wood, and the wood crackled with the sound of a small, private grief. There is a particular quality of silence that comes after everyone is gone. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a room that has just learned it is no longer needed. Zeus stood in it, his bronze cuirass still cool against his chest, the thunderbolt a quiet weight in his hand. You do not need to imagine the weight of a weapon that can end worlds. It is enough to know that it was heavy, and that he did not set it down. He simply stood, breathing, and the silence of the abandoned hall filled the space around him like water filling a basin. Athena had not moved from the edge of the colonnade. Her gray eyes were still fixed on the eastern horizon, where the column of smoke and fire had grown broader, darker, closer. The wind that reached her now was hot and carried the taste of ash. She had not drawn her spear. She did not need to. Her stillness was a form of armor, and in that stillness, she had already made the calculation her father was still struggling to complete. This was not a battle they could win with force alone. Something else would be required. Zeus turned from the hall and walked to the armory. It was not a room of walls, but a clearing on the mountain's shoulder, open to the sky, where the weapons of the gods rested in the care of ancient, silent Cyclopes, who had long since retreated into the deep earth. The adamantine sickle lay on a plinth of dark stone, its curved blade catching no light, absorbing it. Beside it, a fresh brace of thunderbolts hummed with contained lightning. He set down the thunderbolt he carried and picked up the sickle, testing its weight. It was cold. It was always cold. He did not pray. The king of the gods had no one to pray to, but he stood for a moment in the open air, the sickle in one hand and a thunderbolt in the other, and he looked up at the sky he had once wrested from his own father. It was still there, bruised and burning, but still there. The thought that came to him was not a prayer, but a recognition that every age produces a test it does not expect, and that the test does not care whether you are ready. He turned back toward the hall, and his face was set. The Fates appeared not on the battlefield, but in a quiet grove on the lower slopes of Olympus, where 3 ancient olive trees grew from a single root. They did not walk so much as coalesce 3 figures of indeterminate age, their faces smooth and lined, at once their hands busy with threads that glimmered in the dim light. One held a distaff, one spun. One measured the thread between her fingers and waited, her shears glinting in the pale light. They had been here since before the gods. They would be here after. Zeus approached them without ceremony. He was their king by title, but he knew as well as they did that the Fates answered to nothing but necessity. The youngest of them, though, such distinctions meant little, looked up from her thread and smiled a smile that held no warmth. She told him of a fruit that grew in the land of the Hyperboreans, a fruit that ripened at dawn and withered by dusk, a fruit that promised strength to anyone who ate it, but delivered only a slow, sweet weakening. Typhon would not resist it. Nothing that had never known weakness could. The plan was not a noble one. It was a deception, a trick, a piece of cunning dressed in the shape of a gift. Zeus, who had built his reign on thunder and justice, now held in his mind the seed of a lie. He did not hesitate. The image of the white cow standing in the Nile shallows rose unbidden, and the shame of it, the shame of his wife, his queen, reduced to a trembling beast, burned away any reluctance. He would do whatever was required. The king who would not bend had learned, in the space of a single night, that bending was sometimes the only path to victory. The journey to Mount Cassius began at dawn. Zeus did not ride a chariot. He did not summon the winds. He walked, as mortals walked, down the slopes of Olympus and across the broken land that Typhon had already crossed. Athena followed at his side, her spear now drawn, her gray eyes scanning the horizon with the cold precision of a tactician. They passed through valleys where the earth still smoked, past rivers that ran with ash instead of water. The world they were fighting to save was already half destroyed. Mount Cassius rose before them, a vast limestone promontory jutting into the sea, its summit wreathed in a permanent crown of storm cloud. This was the place where the old storm gods of the Near East had been worshipped for millennia, a place where the boundary between earth and sky had always been thin. Zeus paused at its base and looked up. He could feel Typhon's presence now, a pressure in the air, a vibration in the stone. The 100 voices had fallen to a low, expectant murmur. The mountain was waiting, and so was the monster. Athena stopped at the foot of the mountain. She did not need to speak. Zeus understood. This was where her role ended and his began. She was the goddess of strategy, and strategy had brought them here to this mountain, this moment, this impossible adversary. But strategy could not climb the final slope. Only the thunderbolt could. She planted the butt of her spear in the ash-covered earth and stood like a sentinel at the edge of the world. Her gray eyes, clear and unblinking, met her father's for a long, silent beat. Then she nodded. Once. It was enough. The fates had given him a weapon of cunning, but they had also given him something else. Something they did not announce, and he did not name. It was the knowledge that this battle would be remembered. Every moment of it. Every feint, every blow, every desperate recovery would be carved into the memory of the cosmos. He was not only fighting Typhon, he was fighting to become the story that would outlast the monster. And stories, unlike thunderbolts, could not be dodged. They had to be lived. He began the ascent. The path up Mount Cassius was a shepherd's track, narrow and uneven, worn into the limestone by centuries of quiet, anonymous feet. Zeus, king of the gods, took it one step at a time. The thunderbolt in his hand cast long, wavering shadows on the rock. The adamantine sickle hung at his side, its blade still cold, still hungry. Above him, the storm clouds churned. Below him, the sea waited. Around him, the silence of a world holding its breath, pressed in like a held note. The mountain had been sacred long before the Olympians claimed it. Ancient altars, crude and weathered, dotted the path, stones stacked by hands that had worshipped a different sky. Zeus passed them in silence. He was not here as a conqueror of old gods. He was here as the last offense against a thing that would consume all worship, all altars, all skies. The old gods, if they were watching, did not intervene. Perhaps they understood what he was carrying, or perhaps they simply no longer cared. Either way, he climbed alone. Halfway up, he stopped and looked east. From this height, he could see the path Typhon had carved across the world, a scar of blackened earth and shattered stone stretching all the way to the Cilician horizon. The monster's vast form was barely visible through the smoke, a silhouette of impossible scale, its 100 heads still murmuring, its tail still grinding the earth into powder. The molten gold eyes, even at this distance, burned like twin furnaces. Zeus had faced titans. He had faced his own father. Nothing had prepared him for this. The ephemeral fruit rested in a pouch at his belt, wrapped in a cloth of silver thread. It was small, no larger than a pomegranate, and its skin was pale gold, glowing faintly with the light of the Hyperborean dawn that had birthed it. It looked fragile, delicate, the sort of thing a child might pick and eat without thinking. That was the cruelty of it. The promise of strength lay right on the surface, sweet and seductive. The poison beneath would take hours to manifest. By then, the fates had assured him it would be too late. He resumed the climb. The air grew thinner, colder, then suddenly hot again as he entered the cloud layer that wreathed the summit. The sound of Typhon's 100 voices swelled, each footstep bringing him deeper into the creature's acoustic shadow. That strange zone where sound became a physical pressure, a weight on the skin. The thunderbolt in his hand began to glow brighter, responding to the proximity of chaos like a dog straining at a leash. Zeus tightened his grip and walked on. The summit of Mount Cassius was a broad, windswept plateau of gray limestone, worn smooth by millennia of storms. At its center stood an ancient altar, not to Zeus, but to an older god, a storm deity whose name had been forgotten. The altar was blackened by old sacrifices, its surface cracked and weathered. Zeus stopped before it and laid the adamantine sickle on the stone. He did not kneel. He did not pray. He simply stood there, the thunderbolt humming in his grip, and waited for the storm to arrive. The waiting was the hardest part, not because of fear. Fear had burned away somewhere on the climb, but because of the space it gave his mind to wander. He thought of Hera, standing in the Nile shallows, her white hide trembling. He thought of the empty hall of Olympus, the hearth still burning, Hestia still tending it. He thought of the world he had built, the order he had imposed on chaos, the fragile, beautiful structure of law and boundary that Typhon had unmade in a matter of days. And he understood, with perfect clarity, that he would die on this mountain, if necessary. Not because he was brave, because he had no other choice. Then the 100 voices fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the roar. Zeus looked up from the altar, his lapis blue eyes fixed on the edge of the plateau, where the smoke was beginning to part. A shape was resolving in the haze, vast, horned, crowned with 100 pairs of citrine eyes. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. The thunderbolt blazed. Typhon had arrived, and the final battle for the soul of the cosmos was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Silence After Thunder. One by one, the 100 voices fell quiet, and the mountain began to breathe. The summit of Mount Cassius held its breath. Zeus stood beside the ancient altar, the thunderbolt blazing in his grip, and watched the smoke part across the plateau. Typhon emerged from the haze not as a sudden apparition, but as a slow, geological revelation. First, the crown of obsidian horns, then the vast humanoid face with its molten gold eyes, then the 100 dragon heads swaying on their long serpentine necks, then the colossal torso seamed with volcanic fire, and finally the endless grinding coils of his serpentine tails. The mountain groaned under his weight. The sea below recoiled. For a long moment, the king of the gods and the last child of the abyss regarded one another across the windswept stone. There was no hatred in that gaze. On either side, Zeus saw a creature who had not chosen to be made, a weapon forged by a mother's grief and aimed at a target he had never selected. Typhon saw a king who had built an order from the ruins of a war and was now watching it crumble. Neither spoke. There was no language for what passed between them. Then Zeus raised the thunderbolt, and the world broke open. The first strike was not a blow. It was a wound in the sky. A column of celestial gold and electric blue lanced from the thunderbolt to Typhon's chest, and the impact shattered the air for 100 miles. The 100 dragon heads screamed. The fissures in Typhon's torso flared white-hot, and for an instant, the monster staggered one vast continental stumble that sent cracks racing down the mountain and into the plain. But he did not fall. He turned his molten gaze back on Zeus, and the sorrow in those eyes had become something harder. Typhon answered with all 100 voices at once. The sound was not a roar, but a wall, a physical grinding pressure that slammed into Zeus and drove him back across the plateau, his bronze sandals carving furrows in the limestone. The thunderbolt's light guttered. The adamantine sickle clattered against the altar. Zeus, king of the cosmos, fell to one knee, his ears ringing, his vision swimming, the taste of blood and ash filling his mouth. He had never been struck like this. No Titan had ever landed such a blow. Typhon was not a Titan. Typhon was something else entirely. The monster closed the distance with a speed that should not have been possible for something so vast. His 100-hand head snapped forward, their jaws closing on Zeus's arms, his legs, his shoulders, not biting, but gripping, holding, 100 separate points of pressure that pinned the god to the stone. The central humanoid face leaned down, close enough that Zeus could feel the volcanic heat of its breath, could see his own reflection in the molten gold eyes. And then, with a gentleness that was somehow more terrible than any violence, Typhon reached down and began to cut. The adamantine sickle, the very weapon Zeus had brought to end the monster, was now in Typhon's grip. He handled it with a delicate precision that belied his scale, as if he had always known how to use it. One by one, he severed the sinews from Zeus's hands and feet, the divine tendons that held the god's power, the channels through which his strength flowed. There was no blood. There was only a terrible, surgical stillness, the kind that falls over a room when something irreversible is being done. Zeus could not scream. He could only watch. When it was finished, Zeus lay motionless on the cold stone, his body intact but emptied. The thunderbolt had rolled from his grip and lay dark against the altar. Typhon gathered the sinews, glimmering, golden, still faintly pulsing with divine light, and wrapped them in a bearskin. He did not gloat. He did not roar in triumph. The 100 heads fell silent. The central face looked down at the fallen king, with something that was almost pity. And then Typhon turned and began his slow, world-shaking descent toward the Corycian Cave, where the dragoness Delphine waited in the darkness to guard what had been taken. The cave received what the monster brought. Deep in its lightless galleries, where the nymphs had once sung and pilgrims had left their offerings, Delphine coiled a she-dragon of immense age and cunning, her scales the color of old bronze, her eyes 2 slits of pale green flame. Typhon laid the bearskin bundle in a niche in the limestone and spoke a single, wordless command. Delphine wrapped her coils around it and settled into the long, patient stillness of a guardian who would never sleep. The sinews pulsed faintly in the dark, the last light of Olympus flickering in the abyss. The world did not know what had happened. The mortals in the valleys, the animals in the hills, the gods hiding in the reeds of Egypt. None of them felt the moment when the king of the cosmos fell, but the earth felt it. A long, low tremor ran through the planet. From Cilicia to the Pillars of Heracles, a shudder of geological grief. The hearth flame on Olympus guttered, and Hestia, still kneeling beside it, felt a coldness brush her heart. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that something essential had just been lost. In the Corycian Cave, Delphine waited. On Mount Cassius, the empty body of Zeus lay beneath a sky that had begun to weep cold rain. And somewhere in the high passes of the Anatolian mountains, 2 small figures moved through the darkness with the quiet urgency of those who understood that the entire fate of the cosmos now rested on a theft. Hermes, his winged sandals glowing faintly, his Corycian staff held low, led the way. Behind him, the goat god Pan picked his way over the rocks on cloven hooves, his amber eyes bright with a fear he was trying very hard to ignore. Hermes and Pan reached the mouth of the Corycian Cave as the first gray light of dawn bled across the mountains. The entrance still pulsed with that deep, angry orange glow, and the air that poured from it was hot and wet, carrying the taste of old ash and something reptilian. Hermes paused, his winged sandals stirring the dust. His Corycian held low. Pan stood behind him, his goat legs trembling, his amber eyes wide. Neither spoke. They simply stepped into the dark, and the mountains swallowed them. The descent was silent. Hermes moved like a thought, his sandals barely brushing the stone, his bright blue eyes cataloging every side passage, every drip of water. Pan followed with less grace, but more care, his cloven hooves finding the quietest footholds, with an instinct born of a life among skittish flocks. The glow deepened as they descended, and the low, rhythmic rumble of Delphine's breathing became a physical presence, a vibration in the rock, a pressure against the chest. They rounded a final bend, and there she was, bronze-scaled, immense, coiled around a bundle wrapped in bearskin. Hermes did not fight the dragoness. He was not a god of war. He was a god of thresholds, of passages, of the quiet moment when one thing becomes another. He sat on a stone at the edge of Delphine's chamber, raised a set of reed pipes Pan had pressed into his hands, and began to play. The melody was soft, woven from the sound of wind through olive trees and the murmur of distant rivers. Delphine's pale green eyes flickered. Her coils loosened. Pan, moving with a silence that belied his clumsy frame, crept forward and lifted the bundle from its niche. The sinews were warm in his hands. Pan had never held anything so precious. Threads of pure golden light, still pulsing faintly with the heartbeat of the king of the gods. He backed away, one careful step after another, while Hermes kept playing, his melody never faltering. Only when they were back in the upper galleries, the dawn light a pale promise ahead. Did Hermes lower the pipes? He looked at Pan, his boyish face creased with a relief too deep for words. And Pan grinned, a wide, goatish, absurd grin that held all the terror they had swallowed and were only now beginning to release. They found Zeus on the summit of Mount Cassius, exactly where Typhon had left him. Rain had washed the ash from his bronze cuirass. His lapis blue eyes were open, fixed on the sky, and they held a stillness that was not death, but something very close to it. Hermes knelt and unwrapped the bearskin. One by one, with hands that did not tremble, he laid the sinews back into their channels. Hands, then feet. The golden light flared. The god's fingers twitched. Then Zeus drew a breath so deep it seemed to pull the air from the entire mountain. And he sat up, and the thunderbolt relit itself in his grip. He did not speak of what had been done to him. He did not pause to recover or to rage. He rose, and the mountain rose with him, and the thunderbolt blazed with a light that had not been seen since the first day of creation. Far to the west, Typhon felt it a sudden pressure, a heat against his back, and he turned. The 100 heads roared. The chase began. Not a battle yet, but a pursuit across the broken face of the world, from the mountains of Anatolia to the wild, windswept plains of Thrace. They moved as forces of nature move, not as beings. Zeus descended from the sky like a thunderstorm given purpose, each bolt a pillar of white gold fire that carved the earth. Typhon fled westward, his serpentine tails grinding rivers into new channels, his 100 voices rising in a cacophony that was no longer a war cry, but something closer to fear. The sea off Thrace boiled where they crossed. Mountains crumbled. The gods in Egypt felt the tremors and pressed themselves deeper into the mud, waiting for the world to end. And then the chase turned south, toward Sicily. The island of Sicily rose from the sea like a shield laid upon the water. Zeus saw it and knew, with the certainty that comes only at the end of all things, that this was where the pursuit would end. He gathered the last of his strength, not the strength of a king, but the strength of a craftsman determined to finish what he had started. And he hurled the thunderbolt. It struck Typhon in the chest, a column of light that split the sky and the earth and the sea in a single, terrible line. The 100 voices screamed. The giant fell, and the world, for a heartbeat, was silent. Zeus did not kill him. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps he understood that some things are too vast, too entangled with the fabric of the world, to be simply destroyed. Instead, he lifted Mount Etna a weight no god had ever moved, and set it down upon the fallen body of his enemy. It was not a burial. It was an entombment, a slow, geological lowering of stone upon flesh. And Typhon's last breath was not a roar, but a long, shuddering exhale that stirred the ash on the mountain slopes. The 100 heads fell silent, one by one. The citrine eyes closed. The molten gold eyes were the last to dim. There is no need to imagine the silence that followed. It is enough to know that it was complete, and that it stretched from the smoking summit of Etna to the empty hall of Olympus, where Hestia's flame steadied and burned bright again. Zeus stood on the black slopes of the new mountain and looked down at the ground that now held the most dangerous creature ever to walk the earth. He did not celebrate. He did not weep. He simply stood, and the weight of what he had buried settled over him like a second mountain. The age of monsters had not ended. It had only begun to dream beneath the stone. Chapter 6. The Bloodline of Buried Fire. The mountain breathed, the winds remembered, and the children of chaos scattered across the world. The silence after the mountains settled was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, a world waiting to see if the stone would hold. On the black slopes of Etna, ash drifted down like gray snow, blanketing the raw wounds of the battle. Zeus stood alone, the thunderbolt now dim in his grip, his bronze cuirass scarred and dented. He did not move. He simply watched the smoke rise from the summit, a thin white thread against the pale sky. Then he turned and walked down the mountain. There was no procession, no triumphant return. The king of the gods descended alone, his sandaled feet leaving deep impressions in the cooling ash. Behind him, the mountain breathed. Before him, the sea stretched calm and golden, as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The world had been broken and rebuilt, and the cracks would never fully disappear. The ash continued to fall for days. It drifted across the Ionian Sea, dusting the decks of fishing boats and the leaves of olive groves. The people of Sicily emerged from their homes, blinking at a sky that was no longer bruised, but a pale, washed blue. They looked at the mountain, now taller, darker, smoking from a summit they had never seen before, and they understood, without being told, that something immense had been buried there. Then the winds began. They rose not from the sky but from the mountain itself, sudden, hot, unpredictable gusts that tore at the sails of ships and scattered the flocks on the hillsides. These were not the steady seasonal winds that the gods had set in order, the gentle Zephyrus, or the bracing Boreas. These winds were wild, chaotic, directionless. They howled with 100 different voices, faint echoes of the roar that had once shattered mountains. Hesiod would later write that these were the last exhalations of Typhon's 100 heads, his residual breath dispersing into the atmosphere, becoming a permanent part of the world's weather. The divine winds brought rain and fair sailing. The typhonic winds brought shipwreck and ruin, striking without warning, leaving no pattern that mortals could learn. They were the monster's final gift to the world that had buried him, a reminder that chaos can be entombed, but never destroyed. Deep in a cave in Cilicia, far from the smoking summit of Etna, another remnant of Typhon stirred. She was called Echidna, and she was the mate the monster had found in the brief, apocalyptic days of his reign. Half nymph, half serpent, she had retreated into the earth when her mate fell, carrying within her the seed of a dynasty. Now, in the warm darkness of her refuge, she began to bring forth the children of chaos. The first to emerge was Orthrus, a two-headed hound, his twin muzzles already baying at the darkness, his 4 eyes bright with inherited fire. Then came Cerberus, the 3-headed guardian who would one day stand at the gates of the underworld, each of his heads remembering a different voice from his father's 100. Then the Hydra, her many heads writhing from a single serpentine body, each one born knowing how to regrow when severed. They were not evil. They were simply born of the abyss, shaped by a lineage that had never known the light of Olympus. The chimera followed, lion-bodied and goat-headed, a serpent for a tail, her breath already tasting of flame. The Nemean lion, golden-furred and impervious to mortal weapons. The Sphinx, her human face serene above a lioness's body, her voice already forming the riddles that would one day haunt Thebes. Each birth was a quiet catastrophe. Echidna did not weep. She was the mother of monsters, and she had known what she was bringing into the world. But as each child emerged and crawled or slithered or flew into the dark places of the earth, she felt the weight of a legacy that would stretch across centuries. Her mate was entombed beneath the mountain, his 100 voices reduced to a subterranean rumble. But his bloodline would walk the world for generations, and every hero who rose would have to face it. On Olympus, the gods returned in silence. They slipped back into the great hall one by one, the hawk becoming Apollo, the ibis becoming Hermes, the white cow slowly, painfully, reforming into Hera. The queen of the gods did not meet her husband's eyes. No one spoke of Egypt. The golden cups were picked up from the floor, the benches righted, the laurel wreaths replaced. But the hall had changed. It was no longer a place that believed in its own permanence. Zeus returned to a throne that felt different. The stone had not changed. The carven eagles still spread their wings on the armrests. But the weight of it, the weight of sitting in the seat that had nearly been torn from the cosmos, settled on him like a second mountain. He did not speak of the sinews. He did not speak of the helplessness. He simply sat, and the thunderbolt rested across his knees, and his lapis blue eyes looked out across the hall with the expression of a king who had learned the price of his kingdom. The hearth flame of Hestia burned steady now, its pale gold light filling the hall. She had not risen from her knees since the coldness had passed. When Zeus entered, she looked up, and her gray eyes held a question she did not ask. He answered it with the smallest inclination of his head. The fire flared, just for a moment, and then settled. Hestia fed it another branch of olive wood, and the crackle of the leaves was the first ordinary sound the hall had heard in days. In the mortal world, the mountain did not sleep. Weeks after the burial, the summit of Etna split open, and a river of molten rock poured down its eastern flank, red and gold and terrible. The people of Sicily fell to their knees. Some fled to the sea. Others brought offerings, terracotta figurines, twists of wool, libations of wine, and laid them at the mountain's base. They did not know the name Typhon, but they understood that something beneath the stone was struggling, and that the struggle would never end. The winds that rose from the mountain became a permanent feature of the Sicilian coast. Sailors learned to watch the summit when the smoke thickened, when the deep rumble grew louder. A sudden gale would follow. There is no need to picture those winds too clearly. You have felt them yourself on a still day when the air suddenly shifts, when a door slams for no reason, when a cold draft brushes the back of your neck in a closed room. That is the last exhalation of 100 heads, still wandering the world, still looking for the sky they were promised. The children of Typhon spread across the ancient world like seeds from a shattered pod. Cerberus found his place at the gates of the dead, his 3 heads a warning that the boundary between life and death was not to be crossed lightly. The Hydra settled into the swamps of Lerna, her breath poisoning the water for miles. The Chimera haunted the mountains of Lycia, burning villages with a fire that smelled of her father's volcanic heart. The Sphinx took her riddles to Thebes. The Nemean lion stalked the valleys of Argolis. Each of these children would fall, in time, to a hero. Heracles would strangle the lion and cauterize the Hydra's necks. Bellerophon would drive a spear through the Chimera's throat. Oedipus would answer the Sphinx's riddle and watch her throw herself from the cliff. The bloodline of Typhon was destined to be unmade, as surely as it had been made. But that was the pattern the fates had woven. Chaos rises. Order answers. The children of one become the trials of another. Echidna remained in her cave. She did not emerge to defend her children. She did not seek revenge. She had done what Gaia had done. She had given the world a generation of monsters, and then withdrawn into the stone. The mother of monsters lived for centuries in that quiet darkness, visited only by the occasional tremor of her mate's distant struggles, the faint, familiar rumble of the mountain that never stopped breathing. She was not forgotten. She was simply waiting, as the earth waits, for the next cycle to begin. The years passed, and the story of Typhon began to settle into the memory of the world. The gods did not speak of their flight to Egypt. The mortals who had witnessed the cataclysm grew old and died, and their children heard only fragments. But the mountain remembered. Etna erupted again and again, each eruption a spasm of the buried giant, each tremor a reminder that the chaos had not been destroyed, only entombed. The Greeks looked at that smoking summit and saw a monster. They were not wrong, but they were not entirely right either. The truth was more complicated. Typhon had never been a monster in the way the stories would later insist. He was a weapon that had learned in the brief days of his existence what it meant to be alive. He had looked at the world with molten gold eyes and seen something he could not name. He had paused once on a mountainside, his 100 heads listening to a silence that felt older than the gods. He had been capable of sorrow. The tragedy of his burial was not that he lost. It was that he had just begun to understand what he was. The mountain still breathes. On clear nights, the summit of Etna glows a deep, sullen red, and the ground trembles with a rhythm that has no source in geology alone. The people who live on its slopes have learned to live with it, the way people learn to live with any buried thing that refuses to stay silent. They leave their offerings, they tell their stories, and 100 voices, reduced now to a low, continuous thrum beneath the stone, continue their long, patient vigil. The father of monsters is not dead. He is dreaming, and his dreams are made of fire. Chapter 7. The mountain still breathes. The monster is gone. The mountain remains, and the story is still being told. The ancient Greeks looked at Mount Etna and saw not a geological feature, but a moral. The fire that spilled from its summit, the tremors that shook the coastal towns, the unpredictable winds that tore the sails of their ships, all of it spoke of something immense and angry, buried just beneath the surface of the world. They called that something Typhon, and in his story they encoded a truth they could not yet express in any other language. Order was not the natural state of things. Order was a victory, and it had to be defended every day. What Typhon represented was not simply chaos in the abstract. He was the untamed earth itself, the volcanic fire that could not be negotiated with, the storm that answered no prayer, the wildness that preceded the gods and would outlast them. Every field the Greeks plowed, every city they walled, every law they inscribed in stone was an argument against Typhon. Civilization was not a condition, it was a campaign, and the monster beneath the mountain was the reason the campaign could never end. The flight of the gods to Egypt, that strange and shaming episode, the myths recorded almost reluctantly, held a deeper meaning. If even the Olympians could be reduced to trembling beasts, then chaos was not merely a threat to mortals. It was a threat to the very structure of reality. The Greeks understood that the gods they worshipped were not omnipotent. They were powerful, but not absolute. And Typhon was the proof. The monster was the outer limit of divine authority, the point at which even Zeus had to fight for his existence. Yet the myth did not end with the monster's defeat. It ended with his diffusion. Typhon's body became the winds. His breath became the volcanic ash. His children became the trials that every hero had to face. The Greeks were too honest to pretend that chaos could be destroyed. It could only be broken into smaller pieces, scattered across the world, and faced again and again. The Hydra in her swamp, the Chimera on her mountain, the Sphinx on her rock, each was a fragment of the father they had never met, a localized echo of a catastrophe too vast to be confounded whole. The name itself carried the truth. Typhon, Typhos. The words came from the Greek typhos, smoke, vapor, the visible exhalation of something burning deep underground. From the same root came typhon, the whirlwind, the spiraling storm that descended without warning and vanished without explanation. The Greeks did not name the monster arbitrarily. They named him after the phenomena he embodied. Every time a sailor saw a waterspout twisting across the Ionian Sea, every time a farmer watched a dust devil spiral through his fields, he was speaking Typhon's name without knowing it. And beyond the etymology, beyond the symbolism, there was the mountain itself. Mount Etna was real. The Greeks could see it, could climb its slopes. could feel its heat. They knew that the eruptions were not metaphors. When Pindar wrote that Typhon's struggles caused the volcano to spew fire, he was not inventing a myth to explain a natural phenomenon. He was describing a natural phenomenon in the only language his culture possessed, the language of story, of divine conflict, of a monster who could not die because the mountain would not let him. The Corycian Cave was real as well. High in the limestone mountains of Cilicia, its entrance still breathes cold air into the Anatolian sky, and its deep galleries still carry the echo of ancient worship. The Greeks who visited it knew that something sacred had once dwelled there. They left offerings to Pan and the nymphs, but beneath those later devotions lay an older memory, a memory of darkness, of fire, of a birth that had nearly ended the world. The cave was not a symbol, it was a scar, and the scar was still visible. But the story was older than the Greeks. Long before Hesiod wrote his Theogony, long before the first stone of the first temple to Zeus was laid, the peoples of the Near East had been telling the same story. The Hittites spoke of Illuyanka, the great serpent slain by the storm god Tarhuna. The Babylonians told of Tiamat, the primordial dragon of salt water, whose body was split in two by Marduk to create the heavens and the earth. The Canaanites knew Lotan, the twisting serpent defeated by Baal. The pattern was ancient, and it was always the same. A storm god rises. A chaos serpent threatens the order of the world. The god wavers, retreats, gathers his strength, and returns. The serpent is defeated, bound, buried. The cosmos is secured, but the victory is never total. The serpent's body becomes part of the landscape, the sea, the winds, the deep places of the earth. The story of Zeus and Typhon was not a Greek invention. It was the Greek version of a myth that stretched back into the Bronze Age and beyond, a story that every culture around the Eastern Mediterranean had needed to tell for itself. What did it mean that so many peoples had dreamed the same monster? It meant that the monster was not a fiction. It was a recognition. Every early civilization that looked at the world, at the volcanoes and the storms and the floods and the plagues, understood that chaos was real, that it was powerful and that it was held at bay only by forces that could fail. The chaos serpent was the shape that fear took before it learned to speak. Typhon was the Greek name for something that belonged to everyone. The Corycian Cave still exists. You can walk to it, if you know the path, through the same wild thyme and limestone scree that the ancient pilgrims crossed. The entrance is wide and dark, and the air that flows from it is cold, shockingly cold, after the heat of the Anatolian sun. If you stand at its mouth and listen, you will hear nothing but the drip of water and the distant flutter of bats. But if you stay long enough, if you let the silence settle, you might feel something else. A faint, deep vibration, too low to be called sound. A tremor in the stone that has not stopped for 3,000 years. Mount Etna still burns. It is one of the most active volcanoes on Earth, and the people who live on its slopes still watch the summit with the same wary attention their ancestors gave it. They do not speak of Typhon now. They speak of tectonic plates and magma chambers and seismic monitoring stations. But when the ground shakes, when the ash falls, when the lava spills down the eastern flank in a river of slow fire, the old name lingers in the back of the throat. Science has given them an explanation. It has not given them a story. And stories, in the long hours of a volcanic night, are what people need. The myth changed as it traveled. The Romans inherited it and called the monster Typhon, fitting him into their own pantheon, their own geography. The Renaissance painters imagined him as a giant buried under Etna, his breath the fire, his struggles the earthquakes. The Romantics saw in him a symbol of rebellion, a Promethean figure crushed by an unjust heaven. Every age reshaped Typhon to its own fears. The monster was a mirror, and every generation looked into it and saw a different face. But the core of the story, chaos buried, never destroyed, remained untouched. And now, in an age that believes it has outgrown monsters, we have not outgrown what Typhon represented. We have simply given it new names. We call it the fault line, the pandemic, the sudden market collapse, the extreme weather event, the unpredictable, uncontrollable force that shatters the fragile order we have built. We do not bury it under a mountain anymore. We bury it under data, under models, under the careful, desperate architecture of prediction. But it still breathes beneath the stone. It always has. There is a reason the story survived. It is not simply that the Greeks were skilled storytellers, though they were. It is that the story is true, not in the literal sense, not as a record of a historical battle between a god and a 100-headed giant, but true in the way that all enduring myths are true. It describes the shape of the world. It tells us that order is fragile, that chaos is persistent, and that the boundary between them is a battleground that can never be permanently secured. The Greeks knew this. They built their temples on the slopes of an active volcano to remind themselves of it. Zeus and Typhon were not enemies in the way we understand enmity. They were two halves of a single system, the thunder and the volcano, the law and the wild, the king and the thing he could never fully rule. The Greeks were not naive about their gods. They knew that Zeus was not all-powerful, that the order he represented was contingent, provisional, held together by constant effort. Typhon was not the villain of the story. He was the counterweight, the necessary darkness against which the light could define itself. One could not exist without the other, and neither could ever finally win. The 100 heads fell silent. The citrine eyes closed. The molten gold eyes were the last to dim. But Typhon did not die. He was placed beneath the mountain, and the mountain has never stopped breathing. The winds that scatter the ships, the tremors that crack the walls, the sudden, inexplicable fear that grips the heart in the quiet hours before dawn, these are not punishments. They are reminders. The chaos is still there. It is dreaming, but it is not gone, and it will never be gone, because it is part of the world, and the world would not be the world without it. You do not need to picture the mountain. You carry your own version of it, your own Etna, your own buried thing that still rumbles in the deep hours. Every life has its Typhon, the chaos that was faced, the chaos that was buried, the chaos that still threatens to crack the stone and pour fire into the ordered valleys. The story is not about a monster. It is about what happens after the monster is gone, when the silence settles and the ash drifts down and the world asks itself what it has just learned. That is the moment the Greeks preserved in their myth, and it is the moment you are living now. The father of monsters sleeps beneath the mountain. His children have been defeated, one by the heroes who rose to meet them. His 100 voices have been scattered into the wind. His molten eyes have closed, but the mountain still glows on clear nights, and the ground still trembles, and the people who live in its shadow still leave their quiet offerings. They do not pray for deliverance. They pray for another year, another month, another day of fragile, precious order. The Greeks would have understood. They knew that peace was not a permanent state, but a daily negotiation with the thing beneath the stone. And so, the story does not end. It has never ended. It is still being written. Every time the earth shakes, every time the wind rises without warning, every time a human being looks at a force they cannot control and chooses, despite everything, to stand. Typhon is not a monster to be slain. He is a condition to be lived with the buried fire, the dreaming chaos, the 100 voices that have never truly fallen silent. And if you listen, on a still night, to the low thrum of the world beneath your feet, you will hear what the Greeks heard. You will hear the mountain breathing, and you will know that the story is yours.